Hi everybody, I'm Richardson with the American Secular Society, trying our first video. I have a lot of discussions and conversations with people about different ideas about our beliefs or our non-beliefs, or just trying to understand us. Sometimes it's difficult to convey those things via text or via a meme. So the idea here is to pick some of the more challenging subjects, go over them in a video. I've got my nerd notes that I'll be going over as we go to make sure I don't miss any points. But the topic for this one is going to be morality. I have so many people ask me, as an atheist, how do you have morals? How can you be a moral being? I think one of the biggest misconceptions about secularists, atheists, skeptics, whatever you want to call them, is that they are immoral or even wicked people. And really this comes from the assumption that morality comes from religion, that there's no other place where morality comes from, simply from religion. Believers only know that because it's their frame of reference. That's where they're taught right and wrong, is through their religion. I personally believe that society and law teaches them right and wrong also, but they tend to put it into that bigger frame of reference of religion. But saying that it comes straight from religion leaves a lot of gaps in logic, such as, if religion comes straight from the hand of God, then why are we born evil? Why not just be born moral? If He creates morality, why not install it within us from the get-go? Why instead are we born guilty? So many claim that the Ten Commandments are a huge basis for morality. Obviously have some issue seeing how all of our moral existence comes from the Ten Commandments, especially considering 4 of the 10 don't really affect your behavior as a moral human being. Honoring the Sabbath doesn't make us moral. If we don't work on Sunday, it isn't really impacting what kind of moral beings we are towards the rest of the world, what we do on Sunday, so long as we're not doing anything immoral. Somebody needs to feed their family of 5 children. By working on a Sunday, does that really make them an immoral person? Thou shalt have no other God before me. This is another commandment. Tough to see where morality comes from that. Some people worship different gods, but they may be just as moral. Another example is the Native American population in the West has adopted Catholicism, but they still have their gods, and they've integrated the Catholic gods in with them. So, some of these really great moral Native Americans that I've spoken to would be immoral if we based it on the Ten Commandments, because that commandment says no gods before me. There's another one about not making graven images. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. A lot of things there that really don't dictate morality. They're just about how God wants you to view Him, almost in a selfish way. I'm the most important thing. Don't take advantage of me. Don't have anyone before me. And those don't really affect in any way moral behavior. The other thing is that there's a lot missing from the Ten Commandments in order to have a moral existence. For example, we don't see rape. There's no thou shalt not rape. There is no thou shalt not commit violent acts. There's nothing about insults. There's not even anything about slavery or any of the things that our society has evolved as truly moral thoughts, and they're not in the Ten Commandments whatsoever. So really the only difference between a non-believer's morality and a Christian's morality is the belief in God. What's troubling about this is that if I should go to hell and a Christian should go to heaven, this is based only on a thought, one thought. To be punished for a thought crime, to me, is one of the defining characteristics of totalitarianism. You can have somebody that behaves perfectly, but they have a difference in thought. So there's a thought crime, and therefore they're punished for their thoughts. One of the simple answers to, how can you be moral as an atheist really comes from statistics itself. We actually have data that we can compare and contrast for morality. As an example, if we would say that breaking the law is immoral, therefore a criminal is someone who has done something immoral. Well, let's look at those statistics. Depending on what poll you use, the percentage of atheists in the general population are somewhere in between 15 and 30%. Let's just say 15%, we'll be conservative. So if we were to look at the prison population, what would we expect? Would we expect it to be similar based on probability? If atheists are immoral beings, then we'd expect the prison population of atheists to be much higher. Well, that's not the case. When we actually look at the percentage of the prison population that are atheists, we see that they were 0.07%. So if we do the math on that, that means 99.03% of criminals that are in prison believe in God. So there's some statistical evidence right there that not believing in a God doesn't make you an immoral person. Another funny question that I don't understand. Believers say, well, how can you have morals if you don't follow the Bible? If you don't read the Bible on a daily basis, how do you have some sort of compass for morality? I tend to have another question. It's how can you find morality in the Bible? In the First Testament, God commits mass genocide of over 99% of all creatures on the face of the earth, including babies. Koalas, pandas, babies, everything is just killed off. And keep in mind that, if you are a being that has all the power in existence, you have options. There's probably a few billion other options besides mass genocide. So right off the bat, that's what we see in the Old Testament. Not a very good example of morality. Usually whenever I talk about all the terrible things in the Old Testament, then that's whenever I say, well, what about the New Testament? You're leaving off the New Testament. Jesus is the ultimate symbol of morality, the story of the New Testament, the ultimate sacrifice. Well, what I see in the New Testament is God starting over. He's already mass genocided every creature on earth, and now he's got himself born in human form as his son through Jesus. Well, what do we have through Jesus really? Every human being is still born guilty, and now the only way that God will forgive you is through his son being slowly tortured and murdered. No forgiveness without bloodshed. And to me, that's, even in medieval times, people would most likely say that that's not a very good example of morality. I've never killed anyone, and I can forgive you without bloodshed. So why would I trust a deity that has to kill for forgiveness as my moral compass? Why would that be my basis for moral decisions? I would accept an apology. I don't need somebody to be killed in order to accept forgiveness, to give forgiveness to someone. And as far as where our morality comes from, if not for religion, science actually does bring morality. This is something that people have trouble believing. But science brings knowledge. Knowledge brings informed decisions, and informed decisions really can dictate morality. Without science, people with mental illness would still be believed to be possessed by demons, and they'd be cruelly mistreated and sometimes even killed, because we wouldn't have that knowledge of what mental illness actually is. It would just be demonic possession. Science brings the moral decision to help those people rather than mistreat them. Without science, homosexuality was revered as evil, wicked, even a disorder in the DSM-3. But now, with science, it's something that we actually observe in nature across multiple species, so it's not viewed as evil anymore. Another example, without science, we don't know brain formation and its impact on the decision-making process. In other words, your frontal cortex, it's involved in complex decision-making. It doesn't form until you're much older. So without that knowledge, then we would say that children would be allowed to marry and have consensual sexual activity. But we know that you need to have some sort of growing period before you're able to make good decisions and before you are at the age of consent. If we were to follow the Bible, the only law that the Bible had was that once women have their first period, then they're old enough to marry. Because they're old enough to have sex, you can't have sex out of marriage. So basically it was based on menstruation. Once a female was old enough to have their cycle, they were old enough to marry and have sex. If we were still to live by that morality, then 12-year-old girls could potentially be having consensual sexual relationships with people. We can obviously see that that's not very moral, so that's another standard that we have for existence of morality that's, in my opinion, better than what we have in the Bible. Another big thing to consider is that living without a belief in heaven and hell gives the possibility of true moral behavior. And I'll give you an example for this one. Let's say that two children are given a cookie. Okay? One child is told, if you share this cookie with the other child, then I will give you a second cookie. If you don't share this cookie with the other child, then I will spank you. You'll get punished for it. The second child is told, if you share the cookie, that would be a good thing, and you should feel good about it because you'd be doing something good. Now, if both children share the cookie, which child is more moral? The most moral child is the one that shares simply because it's the right thing to do, not the one who does so in order to receive a reward or avoid a punishment. That's what heaven and hell do to us through childhood indoctrination. Believers behave in a way in which to make it to heaven or avoid hell. I guarantee that if the heaven and hell bit weren't in the Bible, there'd probably be a lot less followers because they wouldn't be in fear of going to hell, or they wouldn't be looking forward to go to heaven. So a lot of the stuff that's in between heaven and hell in the Bible would just be making no sense, and the morality that exists outside of those crazy archaic rules that are in the Bible would exist, and people would just live by those morals without having to worry about heaven or hell, or picking and choosing what other things they believe to avoid hell or to make it to heaven. If we did live by those morals that are in the Bible, then we'd be supporting slavery. We'd be subjugating women, putting them in positions lower than men. We'd be murdering homosexuals or people from different tribes or religious beliefs. We'd be sustaining marriage even if there were rape and violence involved. At all costs, we'd be sustaining a marriage. And most of all, the biggest lesson is we would be thankful that an innocent man was murdered. To me, that's just not morality. And surely no sane individual outside of the scope of religion and what they've been brought up, or the sense of community that they've got from being a part of religion, if they were apart from that and they heard those things, they wouldn't call those things moral. It would be immoral. So what happens, though, is that they claim to live by the Bible and the Christian faith, but they just passively look over all of the other terrible stuff, such as commanded murder, rape and abuse of children, mass genocide, genital mutilation, inequality of women and homosexuals, and the eternal torturing of innocent people through the flames of hell. They just look over that. There's a reason the majority of people who have faith, granted, they get it in childhood, because if they intelligently and objectively looked at the stuff that's in the Bible like that, as an adult would, they'd be confused as hell where the moral bit comes into play. It wouldn't make sense. But as a child, whenever you've got heaven and hell, punishment and reward, and it's simpler to understand, that's why they say childlike faith. And that's sort of what happens, is the indoctrination process just makes it easier to believe as you get older. The point is that although non-believers have a different way of looking at the world, they can still have morals and behave just as morally, if not more morally, than those of faith. After all, we have no point in our history where we have murdered people who have different beliefs than us, simply because of those beliefs. And I'm not trying to say that to attack or belittle believers. It's not my objective here. Instead, I simply wish for understanding and knowledge of morality and how it exists outside of religion. After all, to say that God is good means that good must exist outside of God, otherwise he couldn't be defined as such. I'm not a bad person simply because I do not believe in the God that you believe in. If that were what made you an immoral or bad person, then we'd be calling Gandhi, Einstein, Albert Ellis, Adam Smith, Carl Rogers, Bruce Lee, Seth MacFarlane, the list goes on and on. We'd be calling all those people bad people. And we all know deep down that they're good people. They just don't have the same beliefs. If believing in God was the only thing that did make people moral, I hate to use the cliche, but even Adolf Hitler would be considered a moral person because he follows those same beliefs as a Roman Catholic. So, call me stupid, ask me why I don't believe, call me crazy, call me a jerk or an asshole if you want. Question my logic and reasoning, insult science if you have to, and you can even condemn me to an eternity in hell if it somehow makes you feel better about your beliefs to do so. But please don't tell me I am immoral. If I had it my way, we could all love each other. No one would judge another person. Unfortunately, because I don't subscribe to some beliefs, I often have to spend time proving that I'm a decent person. So all I ask is, simply because we don't have the same beliefs as you, don't automatically assume that we're not good people or that we're not moral. And look at the evidence that morality does exist outside of the Bible. For instance, the Supreme Court just passing the law about homosexual marriage. You know, that's something that the general population views as moral. They've evolved beyond that mode of thinking, even though the Bible doesn't teach that. You know, something that's thousands of years old can't adapt to new ideas. And whenever knowledge brings new ideas, which bring better moral behavior, it outgrows something that's thousands of years old. So that's the moral of the story. Pardon the pun. Again, I'm Joshua Richardson for the American Secular Society, and I'm telling you, atheists can be moral. Thanks for listening.